What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Thinking Market. And honestly, I feel like I have more questions today than I do answers. So I don't know what that means as far as a podcast goes, if that's good or bad or wrong or right, but that's just how I'm feeling right now. And what I want to ask is, why are we afraid? Why am I afraid? I think the thinking market, if nothing else, just helps me process and think about my own thinking. And I do want to give a little bit of historical analysis to kind of set up where I'm trying to go with this, but also where I'm coming from. If you look at, okay, I guess coming back to the meta theme of freedom, there's, in my opinion, two types of freedom. You have this internal psychological freedom, and you have this external societal freedom, which is more of having to do with economics, politics, customs, ideologies. Well, perhaps ideologies is more the internal psychological freedom, but on the societal end, the external end, you have people who basically from primitive tribes had the fear. And this is what Thomas Hobbes said, described the state of nature. That in the state of nature, people are at each other's throats. Therefore, we should give up some of our liberties to this system of government, and they will protect us. They will lead us into what we would consider a civilized society. Moreover, primitive life conditions, the autarkic life of the isolated individual or isolated family, obviously has to confront the predators and Mother Nature. But yeah, this is the whole idea of like government exists to protect us and let us live in a civilized society, as people refer to it as a necessary evil, but it's evil and it's not necessary. And so I think what I kind of want to get into is this psychological manipulation of, I guess, more customs and ideologies that lead us into acquiesce our freedoms and give them to the governments. And actually, I want to mention a phenomenal essay. This is an essay called The Politics of Obedience, a Discourse on Voluntary Servitude, by Etienne Laboetie, who was considered the French, I want to say, father of political philosophy. And he lived in the 16th century. He was born in 1530. He wrote this essay when he was 18 years old, but didn't publish it himself. He died when he was 32 years old. He was friends with Montaigne, and I think he helped get this essay published. But it later was the inspiration for many pacifists and anarchists, like Tolstoy, Gandhi, Rothbard, and others. And there's a good edition published by the Mises Institute that has a introduction by Murray Rothbard, which is almost like half the essay itself in length. But he gives a good description, a historical description of France. You know, this was when the late Renaissance age of Europe. And I was listening to Jeffrey Tucker kind of describe that historical setting, that like in that late Renaissance era, people finally had a little bit more wealth. They had a little bit more money. And what is money? Money is the ability to have choice. It's not wealth per se, but it is a medium to kind of interchange and exchange for real goods and services that are real wealth. Wealth is like what you can actually buy. So the more money you have, ideally, the more choice you have. But this is a little bit of a digression. As money becomes devalued, even though you can have more money, nominal revenue, nominal uh, increase in the money supply, your real purchasing power, your real monetary wealth, like, is something that's separate. But anyways, we'll get into that. I feel like because this show is only on its third episode, there's so many topics in economics that I want to go over, like communism, the history of communism, even before Karl Marx, coming from the Calvinists and like this Christian idea, but it's a secularized idea of giving one's life up for not God but for the state. Anyways, so Weti writes this essay on on obedience, on voluntary servitude, and instead of asking, how do we overthrow a tyranny, a tyrannical government, he asks, why do we accept and acknowledge a tyrant in the first place? And it's a very fascinating essay, and that's kind of, I guess, not only want to recommend, but discuss a bit as the intellectual influence for these ideas and these questions. Is this fear of freedom justified? Where does it come from? Moreover, if perhaps we back up a bit, I want to think that for myself, I think a lot of people conform, and he says people conform due to like custom and ideology, but sorry, I'm kind of looking at my notes here. I guess I just want to kind of raise some questions, but also go on a tangent of like what I was thinking about last night. That like, if we have a fear of being alone, in that sense, I think that drives us to conform. Because if there's a group and we feel alone or isolated, we kind of have the tendency to want to join the group. And maybe the group, has a certain ideology. So I think that will make us more fertile and susceptible to adopting those ideas, even though they may not necessarily be right. They may not necessarily be wrong, but we may not even just care to think about them. And I think that's what we kind of see a lot, at least I've seen, with like leftists being at Occidental and whatnot, that like a lot of it is not even for the search of truth, but for social status. Students coming to a new college, they want to be accepted, they want to be cool, they want to be acknowledged and popular. So not only do they dye their hair, and I've dyed my hair, so I feel like I could say that, but they adopt a lot of these ideas, even with the ideas of their professors. Oh my gosh, this is a professor. He has this idea that's anti-capitalism, and he's saying it's exploitation, and that this is all due to racism. Like, isn't that stunning and brave? And it's like, okay, maybe in that milieu, yeah, but like, if you take 2 seconds to, look deeper and beyond this, and try to figure out for yourself, like, what is truth? How do we arrive at truth? What is our epistemology? How do we know what we know? How do we verify or validate or deductively conclude what is right, what is wrong? And that's the thing, that like, if you are someone who swims not purely on the left, ideologically, but you are forced into these certain settings, or just by circumstance, you learn to swim and survive in these different milieus. And that's such a trait and attribute developed by, at the moment, people on the right, because like, what do you mean tolerance? Who has more tolerance? Obviously it's people on the right who have to listen, whereas people on the left will scream and shout and walk away and not want to conversate at all. And in fact, they'll ostracize you. So this is firsthand experience. But anyways, where am I going with this? I think a lot of, the fear is in a way justified, because if we can acknowledge that we have these like biological DNA tendencies, physiological tendencies of like fight or flight, and like the parasympathetic nervous system, when we sense danger and threats, perceived fears, right? If you look historically, anarchists, people were imprisoned, people were tortured, people were put to jail. My favorite Spanish scholastic of the 16th century, Father Juan de Mariana, he wrote a couple works. Demonite. Okay, wait, hold on. Give me a second, because I had it pulled up earlier. But the Spanish scholastics of 16th century Spanish scholastics were actually the proto-Austrian economists. In fact, this would be considered the Spanish school of economics. And so Juan de Mariana, check this out. He faced scrutiny and controversy. It led to his imprisonment. He developed this idea of tyrannicide, that if there's a tyrannical ruler, you not only have the right to overthrow him, but the right to kill him. So this was like the idea of regicide, killing a ruler, but like tyrannicide was like killing a tyrant. So he criticized the royal monetary policies and the Spanish fiscal officials of fraud, and arguing that the king did not have the right to debase the currency without the consent of the people. In his work, De Monete Mutatione, I believe is Latin. And so this was considered a direct challenge to authority King Philip III. This book was put on trial. The book was put on trial, not even him. The book lost, and the book was burned. He also wrote a book, De Rege et Regis Institutione, on the king and the royal institutions in 1598, which was controversial. And this was the discussion of tyranny and the justification for overthrowing a tyrannical ruler. But even if you... So also, like, definitely what I'll continue to talk about on this podcast is anarchism and the history of anarchism. And a lot of people ask this, like, wow, you're an anarchist, but they don't understand that, like, there's anarcho-communist, there's anarcho-capitalist, what's the difference, yada, yada, yada. Historically, anarchism, now that I think about it, talking about the Chinese, Lao Tzu, Chuang Tzu, Suma Qian, Pao, these guys were the first anarchists, and they were, I guess, free market thinkers. They weren't communists. So in the late 18th, 19th, 20th, 19th for sure century, you had anarchists, but they were communists. Not all of them necessarily Marxists, but they thought that private property exists because the government legally enforces it. And so if you get rid of the government, there won't be any private property, and we'll arrive at the communist utopia, I think, more or less. But over time, anarchism became more identified with the economic system of capitalism. That means that private property rights, the government as an institution, is a negation of private property rights. They're saying we have to exist to protect your property, but in order to protect your property, we need taxation, which means it's a violation of your property. Not only that, if you look at something like the draft is the ultimate violation of freedoms. It's the violation of your right to life and to live. The whole idea of the government is to like protect citizens. But if they say, oh, we need a draft to go to war, they're saying, no. The citizen should give up their life to protect the state and the government. So it's this complete inversion of what the hell freedom is. And like there's so much there, and I wrote a little bit about it in my book and stuff, and I'm also going to write more about it, and we'll talk more about it. But like Thomas Hitler has a good book. He's a French historian, called Citizens, Soldiers, and Armies, I think, on the French and Prussian revolutionary periods, and how there was this whole obedience revolution that like it was hard to conscript soldiers, so we had to bribe them. But then we just culturally, ideologically made a revolution of saying that like, oh, if you're a good citizen, you'll be obedient and you'll join the army. Like that's what a good noble citizen does. And so honestly, on my mind, I want to go after some of the right-wing conservatards, and I use that endearingly because, frankly, a lot of these people, and I'm 27, so I'm like, I don't know, a Gen X or Gen Z. Sorry, not Gen X. I'm a boomer. I'm a Gen Z, but growing up, I've run into these older boomers and Gen X and whatnot that are like, we gotta support the troops, and we gotta love this country. That's what freedom's about. And now I'm like, you don't know what freedom is. We're LARPing in this country of the idea of freedom. The founding fathers made a mistake with going towards a democracy. Frankly, I think they had the opportunity to have freedom, but like we went to a democracy, okay? What is a democracy? Well, okay, some people will be like, it's a republic. Shut up. A democracy, as the most fanatic advocate Rousseau described it as, is nothing more than a mild, moderate form of communism. So how can you tell me that the land of the free is in a war against communism throughout the 20th century when the system we have is just a moderate form of communism? To me, that means this is not really the land of the free. And in fact, politicians are LARPing, they're grifting that this is the land. They're saying you are free, but you're not really free. We're just going to tell you that so you feel good. That's why it makes me fucking sick to hear all these people when they're saying like, this is the land of the free. And I'm looking that we're losing our freedoms every day. Even look at 2020, COVID, lockdown crisis, the authoritarianism that was rampant. And then people will be like, oh, but this is relatively the most free. Like, where else is more free than here? And it's like, bruh, in a snap of my fingers, this is what history is. History has never been achieved of the freest land. And if you think this is the ultimate form of governments, then like, buddy, like, you gotta wake up. But that's the thing, is like, Garrett Garrett wrote a great essay called The Revolution Was, and I haven't read it, but the thesis is that revolutions happen without you kind of really realizing it. You kind of recognize it in hindsight, that like, oh, that was a revolution, right? So then you have these places that are like adopting these new currency ideas. Places are going to become more free. Like, history is not static, it's dynamic. And you just have to recognize, like, what is the path, the relative path that we're on? Not even we, but, like, just in general. Like, one country compared to another. And, I think that, like, when people make this argument that, like, well, we're relatively more free, I think they really don't think that we are the most free. I think they're just, like, trying to cope with the loss of freedoms and just trying to, like, be comparatively superior to anyone else. But then it's bullshit. Then you're not really free. So this is more just like a theoretical proposal of actually considering what is freedom. Because if you say you actually do care about freedom, then I'll tell you your biggest threat to freedom is the government. What do you think democide is? Like, and this is the thing people don't know about democide. Rudolf Rommel. This is the murdering of people by their own governments. Okay? genocide is like, if you want to define it as murdering of like all foreign governments or whatnot, other governments, but democide is one's own government. And so if you look at the 20th century alone, 180 to 220, you can't even count the numbers because the bodies are just stacked, of people who died by the hands of their own governments. So, and even like myself or other people will be like, wow, like I don't want to listen to this. This is dark. But it's like, okay, it may be dark, but at least now you're informed on the nature of the state. On You won't be ignorant to like what the state is, what government is. Um, Government is the one who imposes this psychological fear that we need the government. And frankly, this is like the spiritual freedom that precedes the external societal freedom, I believe. And this is where Boetti arrives at, is this idea that like we need mass civil disobedience. He's pacifistic in this sense. I mean, I don't think he directly says he's a pacifist, but he's saying that we don't need like violence or revolution or anything, but that we need like just civil disobedience. Like, don't consent to these tyrants. And he didn't go as far to say like all governments, but I will go that far as an anarchist. And this is one point that Thaddeus Russell, who I really enjoy listening to, likes, to make, that like the government needs bodies. As a kid, I did want to join the FBI or the CIA because I believed we're the good guys. I thought this is like the coolest shit ever, and this is what's noble. And even like ideas of the army and police, I thought this is what's cool and like and good. Like, how can we be bad? Like, we're fighting for good. But then I started to fucking think and realizing that like, oh shit, that's not what's good. In fact, that's what's called being propagandized and being bribed. And frankly, because I know some cops, I know some people who like probably respect the FBI and CIA, but it's like the CIA is the president's military. The CIA is the American equivalent to the KGB. These people, I mean, they'll do what they want on one hand, but like that doesn't make it good. It doesn't make it right. Like, what is right? What is justice? If you look at the philosophy of justice, of jurisprudence, um, this is partially, I believe, what sparked the French Revolution, is this idea of injustice, right? So justice is this idea of like the punishment meeting the severity of a crime. But if the punishment is too severe, that can be considered injustice. And if the punishment is not severe enough, that can be considered injustice. So when you have this balance that is continuously needing to be discovered for all situations, and it's going undiscovered but way too blatantly, this becomes considered injustice to people. And I think obviously you want the market alternative for justice, because then you have, exponentially more minds deciding on what is just in a society, rather than like the king or the queen or the Supreme Court, yada yada yada, 9 people. Give me a break. But so I guess the fear is just something that gets imposed. Yeah. I think also, if I want to go harder on this idea of patriotism, I gave a lecture that I do for the Menger Institute on like all the financial benefits you get from joining the military. So these people are being bribed. And then like, as children in public schools, we have to say the Pledge of Allegiance every day. And then we have to, just all this stuff. The whole military idea is dumb. Like, it's for war, right? Or defense. The Department of Defense, prior to World War II, was considered the Department of War. And it's like, if you care about freedom, the only way to have freedom is if you have peace. Because if there's no peace, then there's conflict. There's antagonism. There's war. So you have to militarize society. That's why the state always wants to have this perpetual threat of war, this existential threat, because then that's what justifies having a military. And that's why there's, invisible foreign threats like a virus. We have to go to war against the virus. We have to go to war against Iran or whoever. This is what justifies the existence of the state. This is what justifies the military-industrial complex. The $5, $6, $7, $8 trillion honeypot of just making weapons and bombs. Nothing of goods and services for the real citizenry who are not trying to go to war. Who are trying to live peacefully and trying to live better and trying to have more choices in their life. So when you remove war from society, you have peace. And that's the thing, is like, I don't want to see these militaristic statues everywhere. I don't care. I frankly don't want to support these affairs. I don't want to be reminded constantly of the tragedy of war. I recognize it. I've seen it. Obviously not like as much firsthand, but mostly, just historical accounts and whatnot. But like, I feel like a free society, a peaceful society, doesn't need to be reminded of the history of wars. Like, and second of all, are you kidding me? Like, wars in the Middle East? Just, why should I care more about that than like historical tragedies, prior to the 21st century, prior to the 20th century? Like, why can't I care more about that? Why can't I recognize those are also tragic and severe? And that's the thing, because they want you to care, because they want you to have a narrative. They want to remind you of who's the good guys and who are the bad guys, right? And so if you believe this narrative, just a good book on this topic alone is by, it's called Public Opinion. Not Walter Lippmann, but maybe Walter Lippmann. Which is the idea, also Theory and History by Ludwig von Mises, where he's talking about, how history is the way it's told is an art form, because someone has to construct the narrative, and no one, we're not there, or if someone is there, what perspective are they having of the situation? What perspective do they internally have of the situation? What perspective are they writing down and trying to construct the reader to have on this situation? So history is an art form, and economics is both theory and history. It's not just history, like statistics, aggregates, empirical verifications, and it's not purely theory in the sense that history is used together with theory in order to create our understanding of economics. Anyways, yeah. So maybe this has been more like thought-provoking or question-raising rather than question-answering, but that's just what's been on my mind, and I feel like getting through this fear is the first step to freeing ourselves from this tyranny. Because as long as we're afraid and subject ourselves to this fear, and this is the quote by H.L. Mencken that's phenomenal, that the average man does not want to be free, he simply wants to be safe. So now it becomes a matter of values. What do you value, right? And not everyone does value freedom. They value safety. They don't care. A lot of people don't care. And that, I believe, is what Wetty was referring to in custom and ideology. That's what makes people voluntary servants and obedient. And I guess that's who I'm not caring to speak to or caring to offend, because it's not someone who shares my values, nor should everyone share my values. I'd rather just express my own values and care to engage the people that are curious and interested and perhaps passionate about these ideas as well, and they're out there. And so again, this is like the illusion of democracy, that to create change in society you need the masses. You don't. This is what Ayn Rand was talking about. Like, the world is changed by the few strong-willed individuals. Look at Ayn Rand, look at Ron Paul, how many lives and minds they have changed from their own existence, right? And so I think that's what's important, is like one's own existential potency in their existence. So with that, I will leave you, and I will talk to you guys later. Peace.